just let me know when you're ready to go. I am ready whenever you are. So I know you have the 6:30 start. It's like 6:29 or something. Yeah. So I don't know what works best. Well, good evening. I welcome you here, and I welcome the people who are listening on live stream, and I welcome the people who are going to hear this program on YouTube later. So we're all going to be hearing Dr. Kathy Davis tonight. She is a professor of chemistry at Manchester University. And I'll have to say, I decided my last chemistry course was 76 years ago. My one chemistry course. So last spring, I decided I was going to learn chemistry. And I gave up after the 5th chapter of the junior high book I was using. So I think anybody who understands chemistry must be brilliant and unique among the human population. Kathy also was on Jeopardy last summer. Some of you may have seen that program as we watched a local person on a national program. So how did she get that way? Dr. Davis graduated from Hope College with a BA in German and a BS in chemistry. She went on to the University of Pittsburgh, where she got her PhD in 2010 in chemistry. Her doctoral work centered around change transfer in biomolecules. Okay. At Manchester University, she teaches introduction to chemistry, general chemistry, physical chemistry, exploring STEM courses, and also a service course, a first-year seminar. Her research centers now around, I have to read this, properties of fluorescent carbon nanodots. Nanodots derived from soy milk. I'm sure you've been thinking about this. So, absolutely. The chemist says absolutely. Okay, so Kathy, we're looking forward to hearing about your experiences.
Well, thank you very much for having me, Joanne. I'm really glad to be here today. I won't be telling you too much about what I do at Manchester in terms of my research or things like that, but I can give you a few remarks on that as well. Do you need me to move that down? Is that a little bit too much feedback? Okay. Before I get into my talk, though, I would like to make a completely shameless plug right now. At Manchester University, once a year, we host a Science Olympiad tournament. And what that does is it brings around 300 students, junior high and high school students, from around the state to the university for the day. And they compete in different science events. It can be something like my husband's going to proctor an event where they build pucks out of cement and they test them for stress and strain when they drop them. It could be anatomy and physiology exams. It could be robot races. It's a whole gamut of things. But this is to say that I coordinate this event, and it takes a large army of volunteers. And if you were ever interested in having some plans for your Saturday, February 15th, and you wanted to spend an hour or two volunteering to give local and regional junior high and high school students a good experience at Manchester, I would love to have you become part of my army of volunteers. It includes lunch and usually a free t-shirt. So if you're interested in that, come and see me after the presentation, and I'd be more than happy to get you settled with that idea. Oops, there we go. Sorry, my slide advancer is just a little bit touchy, so sometimes it'll go through things a little faster than I wanted it to. Like Joanne said, I got my BS and my BA at Hope College in Holland, Michigan. Before that, though, I am a Michigander. I'm from the Detroit area, Dearborn, Michigan, to be exact. And to give you a little bit of background there, I renegotiated my bedtime with my parents when I was pretty young so that I could watch Jeopardy. That was on at 7:30, and that was getting a little close to bedtime sometimes. So I would stay up and watch that pretty religiously every night. I'm also a very competitive person, and so anything that had competition that wasn't sports in middle school, high school, elementary school, you could probably find me on that team. So I've done a lot of trivia-related things in a lot of different areas for quite some time. That did not continue into college. I spent more time in the music side of things or in the undergraduate research side of things. Those were the things that I did when I was working on my BS and my BA at Hope. But one thing that is very fun is that 20 years ago, just about now, I was over in Vienna, Austria, doing a study abroad that was part of my German degree. And there was a guy named Ken Jennings who was winning a whole lot of Jeopardy games. And he was winning when I left in August. And every once in a while, when I would call home and talk to my parents, I'd ask if Ken was still winning. Ken's streak actually did end when I was in Vienna. There was one of those calls home, and it was around Thanksgiving, I think, where they said, yeah, he lost now. But it was one of those things that I was even following during college. I didn't watch as much because I had different obligations in the evening, but still followed Jeopardy a fair bit. After that, I did go to the University of Pittsburgh, and what I did do in that doctoral research was I would take biological molecules like proteins or DNA analogs, and I treated them as unbiologically as possible. Because Joanne, if you're afraid of chemistry, that's how I feel about biology. So I worked with these proteins and these, I worked with these proteins and I worked with these DNA analogs to try and see how electrons would move through them. Especially the DNA analogs, we wanted to see if they would move charge like wires. And so that's when Joanne says charge transfer in biomolecules, that's what I was doing. And I carried some of that into my research at Manchester, where the best way of putting it now is that we take soy milk and we burn the heck out of it in a pressure cooker. And those carbon nanodots are really just fancy soot. And we try to understand how that fancy soot moves electrons or accepts electrons, how it could be used as catalysts to move electron transfer reactions in a direction that we want them to go. So that's one line of research that I have with my students. I have been here since 2010, and I should mention along the way in college, I did meet a fellow chemistry major, Matt Davis, and I married him pretty soon into grad school. We both went to Pittsburgh together. He, of course, lives here with us now, and we have two boys, Felix and Marcus. Right now, they are 11 and 6. We live in town, so you may have seen them around. You may have heard them before you see them. They're pretty active boys for their age and still learning how to modulate their volume. But they're good kids, into math and science, not terribly surprisingly. But my husband and I both work at Manchester. I am a full professor in the chemistry and physics department. Matt is our laboratory coordinator, and we both work with students on a very regular basis. Fun fact also, I came here when it was still Manchester College, so I still had a couple of years of NC before it changed over. So I was on Jeopardy in the spring/summer of 2024. And this was a longish process. I'll tell you a little bit about that as I kind of go through my slides here. But it was a fascinating experience. And one of the things that I purposely did as I was getting ready for Jeopardy and as I was going into the studio was to go into it thinking, what can I learn? What can I discover? What can I experience? Because I knew that personally for me, if I focused on those things, I would be less nervous in the competition. And like I said, I've been involved in competitive experiences since I was young. So I have techniques for handling nerves. And one of them is just to get curious and to get open and to get looking for discoveries. And so one of the things I did find myself thinking is, oh, I think they're doing this thing for that reason, or I think that this happened because this. And so when I was trying to come up with a good hook for my talk, I was realizing that some of the things that the Jeopardy production staff was doing have things in common with the way I might set up or approach teaching, so approach pedagogical practices. And so I did want to kind of go through a few superficial differences between them first. So first off, the goal of Jeopardy is, of course, to make good television, which is not a goal when I go into designing a classroom. Another superficial difference between the two is that there is prize money involved with Jeopardy. Last I checked, I do not reward my students with actual money for doing well, right? They take home grades or maybe extra credit points or something, but I do not pay them for their grades and their achievements. Just so you know, by the way, I came in third in my episode. First place takes home all the money that they won. Second place takes home $3,000, and third place takes home $2,000. So I did not come home flush with cash. They do that to encourage betting. That they found in the early days when everybody would take home their prize money, that if you had everybody take home their prize money, people would play until they got an amount of money that they wanted, and then they would stop. And so they wanted a better game, and so they introduced the prize money concept. One thing that is similar between the two of them is, yes, college experience and the Jeopardy experience have an application process. The application process for Jeopardy can take much longer than the application process for college. It starts with an anytime test, which is multiple choice and online now. It's been that way for almost 20 years. They moved to the anytime test right around the time I started in grad school. Or not multiple choice, it's just an online test. And it goes into their system, and they're very upfront when you take that test. They may or may not call you back. And if you haven't heard back from Jeopardy within a year, you can retake the online test and go back into their system. And so you can just keep doing that process over and over. That's phase one of the application process. If you're lucky, and I was very lucky as far as I can tell, you get called back and actually emailed back by a member of the production team, and you're taking a version of the anytime test in a proctored format on Zoom. They want to make sure you're not cheating, right? So everybody is taking that test. There were a bunch of us in a bunch of Zoom squares. It was the summer of 2021, so it was all very, very Zoom and COVID-y and virtual. But we were watched by a production assistant to make sure that our score was genuine, that we could reproduce that in a proctored environment. And they tell you at that point, you're in the next phase. It's a really low acceptance rate, and you probably won't hear back from us. If you don't hear back from us in about a year, then you can go back to the anytime test and you can restart the whole process. And some people get stuck in that loop, actually. If you're really lucky, like I actually was, a few months later, they called me back actually, no, it was about a year later. They called me back and said, we'd like you to play some simulated games on Zoom. And so they brought together a dozen or so contestants on Zoom with a production assistant. And we just played snippets of games. So we held up our pens like they were buzzers. And the production assistant said, we're not gonna look for the first person to buzz in. We're just gonna recognize you from time to time. But we want you to practice like it's real. And they did mini interviews like you would do with Ken at the first half of the first single Jeopardy. And when that was over, they said, congratulations, you're in our contestant pool. And you'll be there for about 18 months. And if we call you back, we might book you for the show. But even Ken Jennings had to do that part several times. And you could just start back at the anytime test and begin this whole process again. And I waited. That was the summer of 2022. And it was getting to be the spring of 2024. And I thought about it from time to time and said, well, I haven't heard anything. Do I want to go back and start it? And I had really pretty much said, no, I'm not that interested. And I got a call, actually. And the funny part is my voicemail doesn't work on my phone at this moment. And so I was getting texts also from these production assistants. They have really good ways of figuring out how to contact you. And so it was in the middle of the school year, and they invited me to book a taping. It was the week of the solar eclipse, actually. So April 8th was the eclipse. And then that Thursday, 3 days later, I was getting a call from Jeopardy. And it was a pretty tight timeline. They invited us then to come out and book the show, and we were taping just before Memorial Day. So front to back, application to episode, my timing was pretty fast. I got in and out in 3 years. And on the first time. So it was very fortunate. I know now from listening to other people who have tried that I was really very fortunate at every step of the way. But application process, right? Both Jeopardy and the college experience have an application process. Do you pay your own way in college and in Jeopardy? Yes, you do. Wow. So if you are a first-time contestant, as I was, then you pay your own way to get out there. Now, that being said, my mother, Melanie Ewing, is in the back here. And it was a trip for both of us. So my parents were very kind on the trip. My husband held down the fort with the kids, and we made a couple days out of it. We flew out on a Tuesday. We taped on a Wednesday. They actually book you for 2 days on taping because they have a couple of alternates in that may or may not get to play that day and would play the following day. So we rested on Thursday and flew home on Friday. We were in Culver City, so not the northern part of LA that's currently on fire, but the southern part of LA is where Jeopardy tapes. But we did pay our own way to get out there. If I had won and they had needed to bring me back, then they would have paid subsequent trips. So for example, Isaac Hirsch, the contestant that was on a winning streak and beat me, he's from Burbank, so they don't have to pay very much for this, but they would be paying his way to go back every time that he taped something from here on out. I started to realize, though, that there were less superficial differences between Jeopardy and good teaching, though, and I will focus on those a little bit going forward. But it turns out that the Jeopardy production team and the way that they structure this whole experience, they're sort of inculcating a certain set of values for the people who are playing. One of them is that they're prioritizing this idea of camaraderie over competition. Another one is that, this is a pedagogical term I'll get into later, and a psychological term, they're providing possible selves that you can see yourself as a contestant in some of these other people, and that anchors you, that helps shape the decisions that you're going to make while you're there. They are providing ways, again, psychology terms, coming up with ways to manage the cognitive load. It's a very overwhelming experience to be on a television production with the people, with the sights, with the sounds, with the stimuli, and they do have some ways to help manage that. One of them is actually that they're emphasizing authentic practice. So this idea that before you get out there and do the real thing, maybe we should have some practice experiences. And then last but not least, I think both Jeopardy and Good Pedagogy are focused on how that participant feels throughout the process, that the best television production and also the best learning happens when there's a certain amount of comfort that is involved, and that's part of the experience. So I'll talk about those each individually. I mentioned the idea of camaraderie over competition. So my production day had 13 people. If you have one returning winner, you need 10 people to be challengers in those episodes for the week, right? Because there's 3 contestants per episode, and one will always be returning. And so you have the returning champion, you have 10 challengers that are going to play that day, and then you have 2 other contestants. One of them is usually an alternate. They're local. They know they won't play that day, but it's easy for them to come in and come back. One of them is one of those people that paid their own way, and again, they book you for 2 days. And so that was actually Jay. Jay beat Isaac the next day. Isaac got food poisoning overnight and wasn't feeling so well, and Jay actually beat him in one of those episodes early on in the week. But Jay came, did not play the first day, played the second day. But one of the things that the production team did a very good job with was prioritizing this idea that we're all in this together, that we belong here and we deserve to be here. And it wasn't a competition. It wasn't one of the old kind of nasty things in science is look to your left and look to your right, and only one of you is going to be here at the end of the semester, that sort of competitive environment. They did not do that in Jeopardy. They reminded us that actually the acceptance rate for Jeopardy is lower than the acceptance rate for Harvard. So just getting through the entire process, you can feel pretty good about that. And again, everybody can do well. They really wanted you to come in with that. You get better television if everybody comes in feeling confident. And so we actually didn't even know that Isaac was the returning champion until the end of all of the orientations of the morning. He was treated like just everybody else, and nobody knew until we were supposed to start. So again, you're not looking up to somebody who already won and sizing up the competition. It just did not work that way. We do similar things at college, right? We want to welcome you into a family and into a group. More broadly than just classes, we make sure that our first year students get linked up in groups. Usually they're orientation groups. They're linked up with an older student or with academic advisors, we're making these communities that they can join and feel like they're a part of. We remind them that they deserve to be here, because when things get hard in a college environment, or even in Jeopardy, when you feel like you're not answering questions as well as you wanted to, right? You deserve to be here. You did the work, and you can course correct. And again, everyone can do well. Even if this particular moment wasn't yours, the next one can be. Put it behind you and keep going. And so it's all about that sense of community, that we're all working together to do something together. I want to tell you a little bit about a psychology concept called possible selves. It's something that I've worked with in my pedagogy, but I also saw it in the Jeopardy environment. So in psychology, possible selves are what you think they are. They're people that you could see yourself becoming. So, for example, if I come to college and I know I want to be a chemist, linking me up with somebody who's already a chemist is a possible self that I could be. I could start thinking about who they are, and if that represents something I like to be, I might adjust my choices. I might look at how they got to be where they were. That possible self helps shape what I am becoming. And they do that a lot in the Jeopardy production experience. So I just put a few possible selves up here. Matt Amodio, Ken Jennings, James Holzhauer, and Amy Schneider were the ones that got mentioned a lot when I was there, because they just got done taping a whole bunch of Masters episodes. And actually those Masters episodes were airing while I was taping. So I'd come back in the evening and watch the Masters episodes on TV. But they would hold up these people, and not necessarily as role models, but these are people who've been where you are. These are people who you could be. Fun fact, they told us during one of our breaks behind the podia, James Holzhauer just likes to lay flat during breaks. He just likes to lay flat on the floor. That's just what he does. But those little pieces of possible selves, when you do them right, what they can do is they can encourage self-improvement. So I see that person I want to be, and I want to become more like them. They can increase belonging and persistence. If that person got there, so can I, and I'm going to hang in there until I get what I want to. And both of those things together work to improve outcomes, right? If you're persisting and if you're shaping your choices to start looking more like that possible self, then you're probably going to do better. And so this is actually something I've had a fair bit of experience with at Manchester. From 2016 until 2023, I worked with another biology professor, Dr. Kristen Short, and we had a grant from the National Science Foundation that was geared towards building programs that would help first-year students persist and retain in STEM. Remember how I mentioned that the older version of STEM is look to your left and look to your right, and nobody's going to make it, right? One of three of you is going to make it. That's unfortunately still the STEM persistence rate, even at Manchester. And some of those reasons for leaving are legitimate. You get through that first semester of chemistry and you realize that you would rather die than do another one of those problems. That might be a good indicator that it's time to go. But sometimes it's because I couldn't find a possible self that helped anchor me and see where I was going. And so it's easier to give up because I don't see where I could go. And that's what the grant that Kristen and I worked on focused on. We had cohorts of students, and we also had scholarship money. So this helps with persistence as well, being able to have fewer financial worries in college. But these students worked together as a cohort. They could see one another and the choices that were being made around them as possible selves, as very near possible selves. They had peer mentors who were a class or two above them. And they'd have meetings with those peer mentors, and they'd be able to see what those people were doing, and they would be able to get advice for how they should go forward. As they got older and they got closer to the job market, we would start pairing them up with people outside of Manchester. Often Manchester alumni. I tried as hard as I could, and Kristen as well, to find those alumni. And so you could meet with somebody who was 5 or 10 years out of Manchester and in their first or second job. How did I get here? Here's another possible self. I can see the next step on the road. Once we got to that junior or senior year, we looked further. You want to go to physician assistant school? Well, it turns out the director of St. Francis's physician assistant program is a Manchester alumni. How about we sit you down with him and you can see what his career as a PA has been like, but also let's leverage his expertise. Let's let him look at your resume. Let's let him look at your transcript. Let's think about what those things are. And what we found throughout that grant and throughout that research was that having those possible selves, and not just like, I want to be a physician's assistant, here's a 30-year physician's assistant. Like, when the gap is big, that possible self is a little hard. But if we start with a small gap, hey, what's my classmate look like? And then we make that gap a little bigger. What's the next level? What's the next level? That our students were retaining better, right? We graduated a more diverse cohort of students who persisted better and longer. They earned bachelor's degrees in STEM that may not have from Manchester. And again, it's that possible selves concept that they could see themselves represented every step along the way that was part of helping them retain. Yeah. It is Cliff Kinney. I cheated on the pictures a little bit because this is actually something that Manchester does fairly well, is that we bring in people from all over. So this center picture, that's Evelyn Minton. She's a recent biology chemistry graduate, and Evie could represent like that next step up. She's telling people about her research. This is near peers. That's Kristen and I working with our classroom in one of our career seminars. Cliff Kinney is discussion day. And you're all familiar with discussion day, right? So, as friends of Manchester. The idea is every 2 years, the campus picks a topic of interest and focuses a day of classes around, well, not of classes, we cancel classes, and we have programming along that topic. I'm guessing that that picture was the sustainability one, and so Cliff was talking about his experience. But honestly, sometimes he just comes to campus events. But again, a possible self, right? A peace studies major could learn a lot from Cliff Kinney and could see a lot from where they want to go in life. Managing cognitive load. So this is another psychology idea that your working memory only has so much space. There's some kind of nice little widgets online that will let you test for this, where they'll flash up digits, 1, 5, 6, and then they'll have you basically repeat those digits back, type them back. But the basic idea is that that working memory, if you're really good, you can hold maybe 7 items in it at a time. And working memory is really, really involved in how you're processing information, how you're recalling information. So imagine on test day, for example, right? You have to access that information. And the more stuff that hasn't been moved back into long-term memory and you're pulling out of working memory, the more increase you have in your cognitive load, that you have to do a lot more mental work to get there. And so you can imagine in a competition situation like Jeopardy, or in a test-taking situation in a class, managing your cognitive load actually matters quite a bit. And there are strategies that you can use to make that happen. And the 3 that I want to highlight from Jeopardy, maybe. Hello. All right. There we go. The 3 that I want to highlight from Jeopardy are, first off, clear and consistent instructions. You know how an episode of Jeopardy is going to go if you've watched several of them, right? And Ken gives the same instructions to the contestants every time. That's actually not by accident, right? In part, it's familiar for the viewer, but also it's helping the contestants themselves manage that cognitive load. Simple text and visuals, right? Oh, wow, that has totally died. The Jeopardy board has a very clear and consistent look to it. It's not a very fancy font. The writing is all capitals. You're not really having to work hard to decode the writing because it's such a clear and consistent visual structure. And then scripts and scaffolds. Again, you can expect the same things to happen in the same places in a Jeopardy episode. Familiar for the viewer, helps the viewer manage the cognitive load. It's more fun for you as a viewer to play along if the structure of the episode is the same and all that's changing is the information. Also easier for the contestants, right? You're not thinking about parsing how it looks, you're thinking about parsing what the words in the clue say, which is actually interesting. Again, thinking about managing that cognitive load, they're different clue writers than they were, 30 years ago when I was little, 35 years ago when I was renegotiating that bedtime. I turned 42 tomorrow, for fun fact, right? And I was renegotiating that fact almost 40 years ago. The clue writers are different than they were in the 80s. And when I think about the episodes that I watched when I was little, I decode them differently than I do now, and I can notice this shift. And so my cognitive load has changed. And so it was a different experience for me with different clue writers. But again, that's important in pedagogy. If my students are spending so much time figuring out what the heck I wrote, they're not going to spend time engaging with the material, internalizing that material, figuring out how they can pull that out again in exams. So I've come to a point now in my teaching where I have some pretty consistent scripts and scaffolds, and there's actually a best practice for this called TILT, transparency in learning and teaching. And TILT is a strategy that you can use where it's a script. I tell my students the purpose of what they're doing. I tell my students the tasks that they're going to complete, and I tell them the criteria that I'm going to grade them by. That way, they're not spending time trying to read my mind. They're spending time engaging with the material, working on the project, that sort of thing. And again, that consistent script and that consistent routine is helping them focus on learning as opposed to decoding. Along those lines, authentic practice is actually very important to one of those scripts and scaffolds that you can provide to manage cognitive load. They implemented authentic practice in the Jeopardy world about 20 years ago when that guy named Ken Jennings was blowing everybody away. The biggest problem was people were having trouble getting in on the buzzer. Ken was just so darn fast. And so what they started doing, and they had never done this before, remember Ken's winning in 2004, Jeopardy's been around for 20 plus years before that, they'd never rehearsed before. They implemented a rehearsal in the morning so that you could experience what it was going to be like before the cameras were on, before the studio audience was in the room. How do I time the buzzer? All of those sorts of things. And turns out, to the sides of the board, so you can see the main clue board in the lower left there, to the sides of those columns of light are really thin strips of lights, right? Mom, could you see them where you were? Okay, yeah. Really, really thin strips of lights. And you as a contestant are managing, we just see the clue board, right? You get to see a full screen clue. I don't, right? I get to see the board and I get to see what clue's coming up. And there's a screen off to the side with the clue so you can read it a little bit better. But I'm watching for these tiny thin columns of light to light up because that is when the buzzers open up. And you have to hit that buzzer as fast as you can. I was hoping, I'm a musician, I was hoping I could use a trill fingering. It turns out the buzzer is too stiff for that. You really do just have to like wail on it like you would a ballpoint pen, like opening and closing it. But you have to manage in your mind when the light goes on and time that just right with the buzzer. And so getting that practice beforehand was super important. And not only the practice, but the authentic practice came with feedback. There were members of the production team up in the front, so in front of the stage between the studio audience and the stage. And all of those things are really just photo gates for anybody who's ever worked with those kinds of materials. And it's just a computer signal. And so they can see on their computer screens at the production table if you're buzzing in too early or if you're buzzing in too late. And they'll give you that feedback and say, hey, Kathy, you're consistently too late. Or Jay, you're jumping in a little bit too early. They give you that feedback so that you can adjust and so that you can have a better chance of doing well. Right? Some of that, it's good as a contestant, the better chance of doing well. but also it's good from a production standpoint because all of a sudden your games get more competitive when more people can get in on the buzzer. That authentic practice made all the difference for feeling comfortable on the stage and for feeling ready to compete. Just having spent, and nobody played a full game in rehearsal. We would play like up to the first commercial break and then change, and somebody would play till the end of single Jeopardy, and then we'd rotate again. So the rehearsal, all 13 of us rotated through one full game. But you got to see all the aspects. When's the light going on? How do I hit my buzzer? Oh, I'm a little too late. Let me try to adjust. You got to experience the, they call it the world's slowest amusement park ride. Have you ever noticed that all the Jeopardy contestants are the same height? Right? It's not because we're actually all the same height. There's a little lift at every podium. And you have to step on the lift, and they watch. They're really good when you're on the stairs, when you're on the lift, right? They don't want anybody to fall over. So they warn you, they make sure you step forward, and it is a very slow lift. But you just get everybody to the same height. Even those little details helped make us more comfortable. It helped make us more ready to have a competitive day. Why do we do this? Well, one reason is that, again, cognitive load, stimulus, sensory overload, all of those things, if I don't take those out of the picture as an instructor, or if they don't take those out of the picture as a production team, you're never sure whether you're assessing whether a student knows something, right, has the knowledge or has the skills, versus they were just really able to deal with the sensory input. And so if I'm trying to get good educational information, good assessment information, it's important for me to try to take the environment out of it as much as possible so that I can tell what they actually know. Making adjustments in context is helpful. Remember, you're a little too early on the buzzer, or video clues over there. Those kinds of things in context can help. That practice helps you understand the adjustments you need to make before you go do the real thing. One of my favorite books is by a fellow chemist. Her name's Sandra McGuire. She has taught chemistry at various institutions. Now she actually runs a student support center at, I think, LSU down in Louisiana. Her book's called Teach Students How to Learn, or there's a companion one for students called Teach Yourself How to Learn. And her basic point is, of course we practice authentically. Of course we close the book. Of course we do the practice test. Of course we do the homework without the answer key in front of us. Because if we don't do those things, we fool ourselves into thinking that we understand everything that's going on. And if we never made our mistakes in practice, where are we going to make our first mistakes? Right? Do you want to make them on the test? Probably not. And so that's why we make mistakes early and often. Rehearsal let us make those mistakes so that we could make the adjustments and come back more comfortable and more ready to go. So I'm a big believer in practice exams. I want it to look just like what my students would do, right? I don't want them to fool themselves into thinking that they know the stuff because they've watched me do it in class or because they watched somebody do it at the tutoring session. I want them to grapple with that material. I want them to make lots of mistakes. I want them to fail before they get to the test. And we have this talk very often about why I don't give them answer keys, why I give them answer keys with only answers instead of a paragraph telling them how to do the problem, why I don't make walkthrough videos, those sorts of things. It's so that they make their mistakes on their own and they figure out how, right? Just like in Jeopardy, you think you understand how to play watching it on your television, and then you get up on the stage and you realize you don't. It's a whole different experience, and that authentic practice helps bridge the gap. The last thing I want to highlight is, again, this idea that making a climate where people feel comfortable and where they can feel good about themselves is really important, both to television production and to teaching. So I put my promo picture with Ken Jennings up here just because That smile is about as authentic as it gets for me. I hate pictures, right? I don't even like that one that much. But I can tell you that the smile on my face is real. I felt so good about myself that day. There's hair and makeup teams that are like making you look your best. These production assistants are reminding you how you deserve to be here and how you're going to do a great job. Like they're just really, really good at those sorts of things. And it comes out, I think, when you watch the contestants. Like just watch a few episodes of Jeopardy and watch the faces. I think you'll see that most contestants, they look relaxed, they feel happy, they look excited. It's really kind of interesting. And so I just put a couple thank you notes up here from various students just to highlight this idea that no matter what I actually taught them, when a student will come back later and say thank you for something, it's not, gee, I'm really happy about how you taught me the light equations, or that was an awesome lecture on Lewis structures, right? Nobody comes back and says, I really liked how you taught that concept. It's things about how they felt in your class. I felt like I could have my questions answered. I felt like you liked what you were doing. I felt like I was able to do anything. That feeling is what's going to help students. It's not completely like blowing smoke at them, but giving them the feeling that they are able to achieve does help. And it's the feeling that they'll take with them, even if they forget all the chemistry that they ever knew, and that they can take into other contexts in their lives as well. And I'll tell you, that feeling is something that I've taken with me from Jeopardy too. That feeling of feeling confident, feeling powerful, feeling like I deserve to be there, that I can take up that space. It does change how you interact with people. And it's really kind of a nice thing to be able to take with me as well. And I want to pass that on to my students. So that's the end of my talk. And I know that there's time still for questions, and I'd be happy to take whatever questions you have. But I did want to end with my shameless plug again. If you would like to help 6th through 12th graders from the region feel confident and excited and empowered with science, come be a volunteer at Manchester. It can be an hour, it can be several hours. You can proctor a test, you can sit in the room and point to where the restrooms are. There's lots of things, and I would love to have you as part of our volunteer army. So thanks for having me, and I'll take any questions. Yeah.
The cognitive load that you talked about quite a bit. The cognitive load that you talked about quite a bit. I wondered if, I know there's a lot of exceptions, but overall, it seems like my cognitive load is less possible now as I get older. Is there kind of a range that becomes a little bit less when?
I don't know what the ranges are by age, but yes, cognitive load and your ability to handle it does decline as you age. It makes me mad too. I noticed some difficulties in Jeopardy, like being there. That's like, I'm really happy I'm playing right now, but 20 years ago, I would have I would have played differently, I think.
Yes. Where are you?
I had the good fortune when we were living in Winona Lake to be right across the street from the college, the Grace College. There was their athletic building. The senior citizens of the area were allowed to come and use those facilities to improve your own condition, and it was a wonderful thing until COVID came along. And of course, it was students only. But as we watched them and got to know them, one thing strikes me. In spite of all of the knowledge that you imparted about strategies for getting unnecessary things out of the way and focusing on what you need to do to get where you want to go, one thing that prevents a lot of time being wasted or not wasted is their cell phones. We do not see any student at any time on the street, inwards, the building, or anywhere else that they are not doing something with their cell phones. Eventually you say to yourself, when do they study?
When do they study? I would say it depends from student to student. And you're right, cell phones are a huge problem, not just in teaching and learning, but in the context of being distracted, and it changes how you interact. One of the nicest things about being on Jeopardy is I got to turn off my phone for the whole day. It was gone. It wasn't there, and it didn't exist, and you do interact very differently. For my students, the best I can do is tell them to turn it off and just say, you will do better if you don't. Or sometimes I will have the discussion with them. I will also often do like exam breakdowns. So right after an exam and when I hand back the scores and things like that, we'll talk about study strategies or things that they did. And one thing that I will often ask is not just like, what did you study? Where did you study? Were you studying in your room with your roommate running Netflix in the background and you were texting your mom and you had Facebook Messenger on with your other friend and you were running TikToks back to back to back? Okay, what do you think that means about your exam score? But you're right, that how do they study is as important as when they study. And convincing a college student to take that time out is hard. Just like it's hard for us to get to do things that we don't want to do. Motivation is hard. And I have not cracked the code for how to properly motivate an 18 to 22-year-old to study yet, aside from hoping that they get the connection with exam scores, that exam scores would go up if they would spend a little more time, or if they would start earlier or turn off the phone. One of the interesting things though, so if you want to learn something new and you want to retain it, you shouldn't actually spend long periods of time doing that. So the exam's on Friday. I should not study for 6 hours straight on Thursday and think that I knew it. Cramming will not do this. I am more effective starting on Monday and spending, say, 20 minutes every day. It's less overall study time, but spread out over time, more effective than waiting till the last second and cramming. And that turns out to be true in like trivia environments as well. It's harder to recall things if you crammed them. It's not fully back in that working memory, or not in that working memory, in that long-term memory yet, where it can be recalled.
I have a Jeopardy question.
Okay.
I was unclear about this. If the top person comes away with $49,000, how much does that person actually go home with?
Oh my. So even my $2,000, it's all subject to taxes, right? I got my check and they took out some taxes up front. I will still have to pay California state tax on it, and I believe also Indiana state tax on it. Maybe also federal income tax. The wingers and I are going to have fun in a few weeks to try and like gnarl out exactly what just happened there. But I mean, if you won 50 grand, you're maybe taking 30 of that. Maybe. It's pretty high once everybody gets their slice out in terms of tax rates.
Okay, other questions, comments?
I don't watch Jeopardy very often, but when I do happen to catch it, it seems like nowadays some of the contestants, they don't start at the top and work their way down on a column. They'll start at the bottom, or I don't know what's the thinking about that?
That's a James Holzhauer strategy. So James is, oh golly, that's 10 plus years ago now. But yeah, you're right, the old strategy, and it's really kind of fun. There's this website called J-Archive, and I actually don't watch Jeopardy anymore. I read Jeopardy. J-Archive has every game that's ever played, and you can look at the board, and you can click the questions in order. My husband and I do this on long car trips, actually. He'll read the questions, and we'll answer them, and it's actually really fun. But the older games, they start at the left, and they go down. And they go down, and every once in a while, if they don't like a category, they'll switch categories and they'll start at the top again. But if you're a person who's trying to rack up a lot of money, and remember, James is actually a professional gambler, right? So he's trying to maximize the amount of money he wins and also shock and awe his opponents. And so, yeah, you're going to start at the bottom of the categories because you rack up more money faster, right? That makes your deficit bigger to your opponents, right? You're winning by a larger amount. And then you're also going to try to tool around randomly. Again, James is a professional gambler, thinks a lot about statistics. And there are statistical locations on the board where the daily doubles are more likely to be located. And so they're not just starting at the bottom and working up to make money, they're surfing for the daily doubles, which don't tend to be at the top of the board. And so it's a different way of playing Jeopardy. I don't like it. I really like the purity of playing a category top to bottom and staying focused on one thing. And so you'll see, like, the way I played was not right in terms of wanting to win a lot of money. Like, I just liked going through the categories and being a completist about it. But that's why, right? Rack up a lot of money, find the daily doubles to rack up more money, so that by the time Final Jeopardy comes around, there's nothing anybody can do to catch you. Right? That's why that's going on. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You feel that playing Jeopardy
I can repeat the question back too.
Do you feel that the Jeopardy part of your life has actually enhanced your teaching?
Yes, I do actually. First off, it gives you an interesting amount of street cred with students, which is weird because most of them have never seen an episode of Jeopardy. But the ones who have, so remember I showed you that picture of Evie Minton, a student earlier? She about cried when she found out that I got on because, like, that's a family institution for her, and she was so excited. My PChem students, we were kind of in on it together. You're not supposed to tell anybody you're competing, but I needed to explain to my class why I wasn't going to accept their papers past a certain date. And so I let them in on the secret. Like, it was really nice for, like, relational building sort of stuff. I have taken some of that stuff into class, though. I have Review Jeopardy in my general chemistry class now, which is an absolute riot. They play as teams, and I have an abbreviated board that we play for about an hour. And one of the things that happens in pedagogy is that little bit of, well, actually a lot bit in Review Jeopardy, that dopamine hit of getting something right and beating somebody and leveraging that competitive spirit, it does a lot. And so I'm too cheap to spring for the phone app that they could all buzz in. And so I decided that they would have runners for each team. It is the funniest thing you will ever see because they are nominating their team runner, and it's somebody on the track team or the swimmer or something like that. They're strategizing where they're going to sit. Some of them are trying to vault the front row of tables, which we've definitely said you can't do. It's like, one thing I've taken from Jeopardy is to kind of leverage that people like to compete and giving that opportunity, doing it in a little bit of a collaborative way because I can't have 48 different people and score them all at the same time, but I can score 12 groups of like 4. So they get to collaborate with each other, they get to think, they get to work through stuff, but they still then get to compete. And it's been definitely a different thing that I've looked at. So.
Did you have any idea the categories?
Oh, no.
No?
That is illegal. So one of the things that you do in part of the orientations is there's a very nice person from Standards and Practices, so the like independent agencies that monitor game shows. There's a predecessor game show to Jeopardy that got busted for rigging, that they did let people know the categories and things in advance. There's a movie about it called Quiz Show from a couple decades ago. Right? You're not allowed to do that anymore. And so the Standards and Practices guy like came in and made us promise that, you know, we were not aware of any of the clues. Nobody had contacted us, so on and so forth. As far as I can tell, the teams are, like the different parts of the production team are separate from each other. Like I never saw, aside from a couple of like really superficial interactions, the people on the production team, so the people who ran the cameras and the mics and the sound, weren't talking to the contestant team, right? The contestant team was who talked to us. They weren't talking to the clue writers. And the clue writers do need to be there, because they're adjudicating disputes, right? If there's scoring disputes, like there was in my episode, actually several big ones. It seemed like there were these 3 separate units. And again, part of that standards and practices so that it can be really clear that nobody's rigging a game show, they don't talk to each other much, if at all. Like it's minimal interaction. So no, I knew nothing ahead of time. It was a little bit of a bummer because the categories in rehearsal were awesome. I felt so good on those categories that I was getting. And you actually tape 5 episodes of Jeopardy in a day. It takes 45-ish minutes to tape what edits down to that 30-minute episode with commercials. And so you can fit in 3 before lunch, and you take lunch about 2 p.m. Pacific time, which is real great for all of us coming from the East Coast, right? You're starving by the time lunch comes around. And then Thursday and Friday, you record those episodes after lunch. And like, I lost track of where I was. But again, that whole day, like, we're not interacting. Contestants are interacting with contestant team. Everybody else is interacting separately. In those categories, there were other episodes where I was just sitting there in the audience, because you could watch from the studio audience the rest of the day. I would have killed to have the Thursday episode, the first after lunch one. There was a whole category on music that I would have really loved to have had. Like, it was an interesting experience because there were just some episodes that I was like, I would have done much better in some of those. But I felt good on what I did, and I enjoyed what I got. But it's a little bit of a sort of a comparison thing where you see some other days going, I really would have wished that I had that. But, oh yeah, there's a lot of luck. And because nobody knew, right? It's not like they weren't tailoring to like, they weren't tailoring to our strengths or anything like that. They have no idea, and they're not supposed to know. Their goal is to put out sets of clues that are diverse enough that they think that they can get a good game off of. And so I just happened to draw one that wasn't quite tailored to my strengths. Although my husband did know the final Jeopardy, and I knew he would while I was writing my shout out to my kids, because I did not know. I was writing Hi Felix and Marcus, and I knew Matt was gonna just like be dying while we watched the episode because he would know the answer. And he did, but I felt really good. It took him most of the music to get there. So it wasn't an immediate one. We had a watch party at my house, and it was really pretty fun. And that was one of the things.
Okay, any other questions, comments?
It seems that all the stuff that goes into that some of those on the minority list of people would have a hard time ever getting on that show.
Yep. And that is, that's a recognized problem with Jeopardy, is that it does seem to be tailored to certain races, certain genders, certain like age to a certain extent. And that's part of, I think, why the clues, like the Clue Crew has changed over the years. I think they are trying to do that. But yeah, it's still, I mean, think back to all of the Jeopardy winners. They're overwhelmingly white, and they're also pretty male, right? And yeah, it's a problem they've acknowledged, but haven't made much headway on so far. I lost to a white man. He was a heck of a player, though. He could get on that buzzer very fast.
Well, Kathy, thank you so much. It's amazing to me how well you've had that experience and transferred some of the learnings to teaching.
Thank you very much for having me.
Great, thank you.